There are dangers that are easy to recognize, and there are dangers that operate in silence. The visible ones can be identified quickly because they appear with clear signs. They create immediate disruption, and their source can often be traced with effort and awareness. But the hidden ones are different. They do not announce themselves. They do not reveal their origin. They do not always produce immediate results that can be directly understood. Instead, they operate quietly beneath the surface of experience. And this is what makes them more difficult to recognize. Because life does not always show what is influencing it. Sometimes what is seen externally is only the outcome of something that has been developing internally or invisibly over time. And when outcomes appear without clear explanation, it becomes easy to dismiss them as coincidence, timing, or normal fluctuation. But patterns are never without meaning. When something happens once, it may be random. When it happens twice, it may still be coincidental. But when similar forms of resistance, delay, or interruption begin to repeat over time, something deeper begins to emerge beneath the surface. And this is where awareness becomes essential. Because hidden influence does not always change the direction of life dramatically, it often slows it. It delays progress that should feel natural. It interrupts flow that should feel consistent. It creates small but repeated disruptions that accumulate over time without always being noticed immediately. These disruptions can appear in many forms. A process that should move forward smoothly begins to slow without clear reason. An opportunity that seemed ready begins to shift or pause unexpectedly. Effort that should produce results begins to feel like it is meeting invisible resistance. Individually, these moments may not appear significant, but when they form a pattern, they begin to reveal something important, that not all obstacles are surface level. Some operate in concealment. And because they are concealed, they are often misinterpreted. They are seen as timing issues rather than structural interference. They are seen as personal challenges rather than external influence. They are seen as normal difficulty rather than repeated disruption. This misinterpretation is what allows hidden patterns to continue, because what is not recognized cannot be addressed, and what is not addressed continues to influence outcomes silently. This is why hidden traps are so effective. They rely on invisibility. They do not need to create dramatic disruption to be effective. Instead, they slowly shape outcomes by introducing subtle resistance into progress. Over time, this can create a feeling of stagnation, inconsistency, or unexplained delay. And without clarity, effort alone may not resolve what is happening. This is where deeper awareness becomes necessary, not to create fear, but to create understanding. Because awareness is what brings hidden influence into recognition. And once something is recognized, it no longer operates in the same unnoticed way. This is also why timing becomes important, because patterns often strengthen when they are ignored. What begins as subtle interference can become more established when it is repeatedly overlooked. Not because it becomes stronger on its own, but because it continues without interruption. And uninterrupted patterns tend to stabilize over time. This is why repeated delay or interference should not always be dismissed quickly. Not every delay is significant, but repeated patterns deserve attention. Not every obstacle is hidden influence, but consistent disruption without explanation should be observed more carefully, because life often communicates through patterns rather than isolated events. And patterns are meant to be interpreted. This is where Psalm 7 becomes relevant, not as a reaction, but as an alignment tool. It introduces awareness into what is hidden. It creates a framework for recognizing what operates beneath the surface of experience. And it shifts focus from confusion to clarity, because clarity is what neutralizes hidden influence. What is seen clearly cannot remain concealed in the same way. What is understood cannot continue to operate unnoticed. And what is brought into awareness begins to lose its silent control. This is why the hidden danger matters. Not because it is everywhere, but because it can exist unnoticed. And anything that operates without recognition has the potential to influence direction without resistance. But once awareness is activated, everything begins to shift. Focus becomes sharper. Interpretation becomes clearer. Response becomes more intentional. And what once felt like unexplained resistance begins to be understood as something that can be addressed. This is the beginning of neutralization, not through force, but through recognition. Because once something hidden is brought into awareness, it no longer holds the same authority over outcomes. And this is where the process of protection truly begins. Psalm 7 does not begin with denial of opposition, it begins with trust in the midst of it. It does not ignore the reality of hidden pressure, unseen resistance, or unexplained difficulty. Instead, it introduces a response that is rooted in alignment rather than fear. O Lord my God, in you do I put my trust. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me. This opening establishes something essential. Protection begins with trust, not panic. Because the natural response to unseen pressure is often anxiety. When something feels like it is working against progress without clear visibility, the mind tends to search for control. It tries to identify the source, analyze the cause, and immediately resolve the uncertainty. But when the source is not visible, this often leads to confusion. Psalm 7 redirects this response. Instead of increasing internal tension, it establishes internal stability. Instead of reacting to uncertainty, it anchors awareness in trust. And this shift is what begins to neutralize the emotional impact of hidden pressure. Because hidden influence does not only operate externally, it also affects internal state. It creates uncertainty, hesitation, and doubt. And when internal stability weakens, external perception becomes more vulnerable to distortion. This is why trust is not passive, it is structural. Trust creates a stable internal foundation that does not collapse under pressure. It does not require full understanding of every situation to remain steady. Instead, it holds position even when clarity is incomplete. And this is where Psalm 7 becomes powerful. It shifts focus from trying to control what is hidden to establishing alignment with what is higher and consistent. It removes the burden of having to fully understand every unseen influence before finding peace. Because not everything must be fully understood to be stabilized. This is a critical shift. Many remain in cycles of overanalysis, trying to decode every delay, every interruption, every unexpected shift. But when everything is analyzed without clarity, it often increases confusion instead of resolving it. Psalm 7 interrupts this cycle by establishing a different priority. Trust first, understanding second. This does not mean ignoring awareness, it means not allowing uncertainty to dominate internal stability. Because once internal stability is compromised, even small challenges can feel overwhelming. But when internal stability is anchored, even unclear situations do not have the same disruptive impact. This is where protection begins to form, not as a reaction to fear, but as a result of alignment. The Lord is a righteous judge. This introduces another key principle. Justice operates beyond visibility. It acknowledges that not everything that is hidden remains unaddressed. Not everything that operates in concealment continues without accountability. There is a structure of justice, not dependent on human visibility or immediate recognition. And this understanding reduces internal pressure. Because part of what makes hidden influence difficult is the feeling that it cannot be addressed simply because it cannot be seen. But Psalm 7 introduces a different perspective, that what is unseen is not unaccounted for. This brings emotional balance. Because anxiety often grows when there is no perceived resolution. But when trust in justice is established, the need for immediate visible control decreases. And this is where clarity begins to return. Instead of focusing on uncertainty, focus shifts toward alignment. Instead of being consumed by unknown factors, attention moves toward internal stability. Instead of reacting to hidden pressure, there is grounding in trust and structure. This is how Psalm 7 begins to neutralize the internal effects of hidden traps, not by forcing exposure, but by stabilizing response. Because when internal response is stable, external influence loses part of its impact. He judges the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. This reinforces the idea that imbalance does not go unnoticed, that systems of injustice, concealment, or interference are not beyond awareness. And this creates psychological and spiritual relief, because part of the burden of hidden pressure is the feeling of being alone in awareness of it. But Psalm 7 shifts this perspective, establishing that there is a higher structure of awareness and response that is already in place. This allows focus to shift from fear to trust, from confusion to clarity, from reaction to alignment. And this shift is what begins the process of neutralization. Because hidden traps lose influence when internal stability is no longer disrupted by them. And this is where Psalm 7 begins its deeper work, not by eliminating awareness, but by stabilizing the mind and spirit so that hidden influence cannot dominate perception in the same way. Once this foundation is established, everything that follows becomes clearer, more grounded, and less vulnerable to unseen interference. Hidden influence survives in one environment above all others: lack of clarity. When something remains unexamined, unrecognized, or only partially understood, it gains space to operate without resistance. But the moment awareness enters that space, its influence begins to weaken, not because everything is immediately resolved, but because concealment loses its advantage. Psalm 7 introduces a principle that directly addresses this dynamic. If there is iniquity in my hands, let the enemy pursue me and overtake me. This statement is not about condemnation, it is about exposure. Because exposure is what removes hidden authority. What operates in secret depends on remaining unchallenged. It relies on ambiguity, misdirection, and uncertainty. It continues to influence outcomes as long as it is not fully brought into awareness. But once clarity begins to form, its ability to operate silently begins to diminish. This is why Psalm 7 does not avoid examination, it invites it. It brings everything into alignment with truth, even when that truth requires deeper reflection, because truth has a stabilizing effect. It removes confusion, it reduces distortion, and it replaces uncertainty with structure. And structure is what neutralizes hidden instability. There is a critical distinction here. Exposure is not about creating fear or suspicion. It is not about assuming hidden opposition in every situation. Instead, it is about removing blindness where it exists. It is about ensuring that what influences direction is not operating entirely outside awareness. Because when awareness is incomplete, interpretation becomes vulnerable. Small delays can feel like major blocks. Normal challenges can feel like hidden resistance. Temporary setbacks can feel like structured opposition. But when clarity increases, interpretation becomes more accurate, and accurate interpretation reduces or unnecessary emotional reaction. This is how hidden influence loses strength, not by dramatic confrontation, but by gradual illumination. Psalm 7 creates a framework where nothing remains fully outside awareness. It encourages reflection, accountability, and honesty with internal patterns. Because sometimes what feels external may also be connected to internal alignment, decisions, or overlooked factors. And clarity allows distinction between these layers. This is important because not everything that feels like hidden interference is external in nature. Some patterns are internal habits, repeated responses, or unconscious expectations that influence outcomes without being fully recognized. Exposure brings these into awareness, not to create blame, but to create correction, because correction requires visibility. And visibility begins with willingness to acknowledge what is present without distortion. This is where transformation starts to deepen. When awareness expands, interpretation becomes more precise. Instead of assuming hidden forces in every delay, there is capacity to examine whether timing, preparation, or alignment may be involved. And this reduces unnecessary confusion. At the same time, Psalm 7 also addresses external concealment. It acknowledges that there are influences beyond immediate perception, but it does not leave them in mystery. It brings them into the realm of accountability and justice. This removes the psychological weight of uncertainty, because uncertainty often amplifies fear, but clarity reduces it. And once fear is reduced, internal stability increases. This is the process of exposure working in two directions. Internally, it brings awareness to patterns that may need adjustment. Externally, it removes the assumption that hidden influence is beyond reach or understanding. Both of these create balance. And balance is essential for neutralization, because when perception is balanced, reaction becomes measured. And when reaction is measured, hidden influence loses its ability to create emotional disruption. Psalm 7 also introduces a principle of integrity. If there is iniquity in my hands, this invites reflection on alignment between intention and action. It suggests that clarity is not only about external factors, but also about internal consistency. When internal alignment is strong, external interpretation becomes clear. But when internal conflict exists, perception can become distorted. This is why exposure is powerful. It aligns both internal and external awareness into a single point of clarity. And once clarity is established, hidden influence loses much of its effectiveness. Because what is understood cannot continue to operate in the same concealed manner. What is recognized cannot remain fully hidden. What is examined cannot remain unquestioned. What is brought into awareness cannot remain dominant in silence. This is how Psalm 7 begins to dismantle hidden structure not through force, but through illumination. And once illumination begins, the influence of what was hidden starts to fade. Hidden traps do not depend on strength alone, they depend on continuity. Their influence is not always in how powerful they appear, but in how consistently they operate without interruption. What remains unnoticed, unchallenged, and unexamined can continue shaping outcomes quietly over time. But once continuity is interrupted, something fundamental begins to change. Psalm 7 moves directly into this principle of interruption. Let the wickedness of the wicked come to an end. This is not a statement of fear, it is a declaration of cessation. Because every hidden structure relies on continuation. It survives through repetition, through cycles that are not broken, through patterns that are allowed to repeat without recognition. But once awareness enters the pattern, continuity is no longer guaranteed. And when continuity breaks, influence weakens. This is how hidden structures begin to dissolve, not through sudden force, but through the removal of their ability to continue operating unnoticed. There is an important distinction here. Many assume that hidden influence must be confronted dramatically in order to be broken. But Psalm 7 introduces a different mechanism: interruption through alignment. When awareness is aligned with clarity, hidden patterns lose their ability to repeat without resistance, and repetition is what sustains them. This is why even small interruptions in awareness matter. A moment of recognition, a shift in perception, a change in interpretation. Each of these interrupts automatic cycles that previously operated without question. And over time, interruptions accumulate. What once felt automatic begins to feel less certain. What once felt consistent begins to feel less stable. What once felt unseen begins to become noticeable. This is the beginning of structural weakening, because hidden systems depend on invisibility and repetition working together. Once either is disrupted, the structure begins to lose stability. Psalm 7 reinforces this by introducing the concept of justice as a balancing force. Not everything that operates in concealment remains unchecked indefinitely. There is an order that responds to imbalance, not always immediately visible, but consistently active. This awareness reduces the psychological weight of hidden pressure, because part of what makes hidden influence powerful is the belief that it cannot be interrupted. But once that belief is replaced with clarity, internal response changes. And when internal response changes, external influence loses impact. This is how breaking begins, not externally first, but internally through awareness. The phrase "come to an end" also introduces finality. It does not suggest temporary reduction, it suggests termination of influence. And this is important because hidden structures often rely on the perception that they are permanent or unchangeable. But nothing sustained by repetition is. or unbreakable. What is repeated can be interrupted. What is uninterrupted can be reinforced. What is reinforced can be reversed through consistent awareness. This is the deeper principle at work. Psalm 7 does not only expose it, also concludes. It brings awareness to a point where continuation is no longer assumed. And once continuation is no longer assumed, the structure begins to weaken from within. Because belief supports repetition. If something is believed to be unchanging, it continues. But if that belief is replaced with awareness that interruption is possible, the cycle begins to lose strength. This is where transformation becomes structural, not an emotional reaction, but a consistent interruption of old patterns. Not sudden confrontation, but steady replacement of repetition with awareness. And as this continues, something shifts gradually. What once influenced perception silently begins to lose authority. What once shaped interpretation automatically begins to weaken. What once operated unnoticed begins to fade into awareness. This is how breaking occurs. Not through chaos, but through clarity. Because clarity is what removes the conditions that allow hidden influence to sustain itself. And Psalm 7 reinforces this process by establishing that what is misaligned cannot remain indefinitely active without consequence. This does not create fear, it creates stability. Because stability comes from understanding that hidden influence is not absolute. It is conditional. It depends on invisibility, repetition, and lack of interruption. Once those conditions are removed, the structure begins to collapse. And this collapse is not violent, it is natural. Because without continuity, there is no system left to sustain it. This is the turning point of Psalm 7 in this process. It shifts awareness from recognition into resolution, from identifying hidden patterns into disrupting their ability to continue, from understanding influence into neutralizing it through clarity. And once interruption becomes consistent, hidden structures no longer maintain the same presence in experience. They fade not because they were fought, but because they were no longer allowed to continue unchecked. There are moments when awareness is not meant to remain theoretical. Moments when understanding is not meant to stay as reflection. Moments when recognition is not meant to exist only in thought, but must move into action. Because awareness that is not acted upon gradually loses its strength, while awareness that is practiced becomes alignment. This is one of those moments. Not a moment for delay, not a moment for hesitation, but a moment for decisive response. Because what has been revealed through understanding hidden influence, exposure, interruption, and alignment is not meant to remain passive knowledge. It is meant to be applied consistently so that internal structure can shift and stabilize. Psalm 7 is not introduced as a concept, that is introduced as a process of trust. A process of clarity, a process of neutralization through alignment. And like any process, it requires engagement. Not occasional engagement, but intentional repetition. Because hidden patterns do not lose influence through single moments of awareness. They weaken through sustained interruption. And sustained interruption only happens through consistency. This is why timing matters. Because patterns that are left unaddressed tend to reinforce themselves. What is not interrupted continues to operate. What is not challenged continues to shape perception. And what is not brought into awareness continues to influence direction quietly. But once action begins, something changes. The cycle no longer remains uninterrupted. The pattern no longer continues without resistance. The influence no longer operates without awareness. This is the beginning of neutralization. Not through confrontation alone, but through consistent alignment with clarity and truth. Psalm 7 provides a structure for this alignment. It anchors trust in stability rather than fear. It brings awareness into what is hidden without allowing confusion to dominate. It introduces justice as a stabilizing principle rather than a distant concept. And when these elements are practiced consistently, internal response begins to shift. Fear is reduced. Confusion is minimized. Awareness becomes steady instead of reactive. This is how neutralization forms internally first. Because what affects perception affects experience. And what stabilizes perception stabilizes response. This is why the instruction is not complex, it is consistent engagement. Not one-time awareness, but repeated alignment. Not occasional reflection, but sustained focus. Not passive observation, but active participation. Because what is repeated becomes internal structure, and internal structure determines external experience over time. This is the urgency of the moment. Not urgency rooted in fear, but urgency rooted in timing. Because there are windows where awareness is more effective when acted upon immediately. Not because opportunity disappears, but because patterns strengthen when left uninterrupted. And interruption must be applied deliberately. Each time Psalm 7 is engaged with intention, a layer of hidden influence loses stability. Each time focus is returned to alignment, clarity strengthens. Each time trust replaces uncertainty, internal balance increases. And over time, something shifts. What once felt like hidden resistance begins to weaken in influence. What once felt unclear begins to become more understandable. What once felt uncontrollable begins to feel more stable. This is the result of sustained alignment. Not instant change, but gradual transformation of internal structure until old patterns no longer dominate perception. This is why the call is simple but serious. Do not delay alignment. Do not postpone consistency. Do not allow awareness to remain unused. Instead, take this moment seriously. Engage with Psalm 7 with intention. Maintain consistency over time. Allow internal structure to realign through repetition and focus. Because what is aligned cannot remain dominated by hidden influence in the same way. And once alignment becomes stable, something fundamental changes. What was hidden loses authority. What was unclear becomes manageable. What was disruptive becomes neutralized through awareness and stability. This is the purpose of the call to move from understanding into consistent action, and from action into lasting alignment that cannot be easily disrupted by unseen patterns again.